Thank you. Well, it's great to be here. It's great to be in a classroom that I took classes in. A classroom that looks very different from what it was like when I was here, because there was a stage here years ago, and the carpet was different, and it's very interesting. It looks great. It looks great. It looks great. It looks great. It's great to be here. And what I'm going to do is do a range of theological considerations, right? So I'm going to talk about, so it's sort of thematic is what I'm doing. Of course, I am going to actually do something with the Dutch theme as well by raising the if Kuyper were here question at a certain point. But if Kuyper were here in the best sense, because if Kuyper were here in his full-throated sense, he would just basically try to take over the whole situation, because that's what he did. That was his personality. He tried to take over everything wherever he was. But we mean the best face of Kuyper, not the totalitarian face of Kuyper. So what I want to begin with is something that it's really basic, but it's really important, and that is just noting the importance of taking doctrine seriously. Now, sure, you're all here. There are many things that have been said that indicate that, of course, people take doctrine seriously. But what I've discovered is, even though you might take doctrine seriously, you may have conversations with other people that don't really see why we need to take doctrine seriously. I must have muted myself. Let's see. What? Thank you. So, it's important to take doctrine seriously, and others may not quite get that, because sometimes people think we shouldn't be paying that much attention to how much coherence we're bringing to our beliefs. And sometimes the reason that people are leery of that is because they've either been in churches or they know Christians who are very zealous about certain particulars of certain doctrines, and they think, you know what, just give me Jesus and let's not sweat all this small stuff. But I have one problem with that. Particularly if we're talking about justice and justice in relationship to ethics itself, much less bioethics. And that is that if we don't do the work of taking our doctrine seriously, bringing coherence to our beliefs, then how we really talk about the relationship between what we believe and what we do, to me, it's going to wind up then being more of an exercise in kind of pragmatism, or an exercise in creativity where you sort of make it up as you go along. And I don't think that that's the best way for us to go about it if we're talking about Christian ethics. If it's Christian ethics, and what do we mean when we talk about being Christians? What do Christians believe? How do we make sense out of what Christians believe? And if one were to say something like, well, Jesus unites, doctrine divides, all I want to say to that person is, just talk to me about Jesus. Because once you start talking to me about Jesus, you're talking to me about doctrine. And the more you keep talking about to me about Jesus in some way that makes sense, you're bringing coherence to that. And you're bringing coherence to that, then what are you doing? You're actually giving me a really, really good doctrinal presentation. And to the extent you think that there's something about following Jesus that's related to that doctrine, you're beginning to move towards some kind of notion of what it means to have an ethics that flows out of that kind of Christology. I'll return to the Christology question a bit later, but I just wanted to use that as an example as to why it's important to take doctrine seriously. Here's another way to get at it that is, I think, important. Again, I think it's an assumption level that many of us may have here, but I won't take chances anyway, and that is, we actually have to ask the questions, well, why should Christians even care about justice? Why is that a priority? I mean, why should Christians ever mention that in their discourse with each other? Or why would they mention that if they're going to be involved in any kind of public discourse? Why should that be important? Why isn't that just something that other people talk about? What is it that Christians believe about our life in this world that would make them say, well, actually we have a mandate to pursue justice of some sort. However, we wind up describing that and parsing it. If we think that we should make it a priority, why are we saying we should make it a priority? What is it that we believe? What is it about how we take the entire range of our beliefs and put it together? What is it about that tells us, yes, you should care about it. You should make it a priority. Of course, it should be part of what Christians talk about when they do ethics. But here's something that would be an interesting thing to do sometime. Go to the library and look at most of the ethics texts and see how many of the ethics texts actually talk about justice, where justice is an actual topic. Not where it's an assumed topic or where it's kind of subterranean, but where it's actually there. It'd be an interesting thing to think about. And I think these days one might argue, well, there are more ethics texts being produced where people talk about justice. But I remember when I was a student here, it was interesting to see that, if I looked at what ethics texts were about, they were about issues, important issues, but to the extent that we think about justice as being something that's public and perhaps politically oriented or has political implications, there wasn't a lot of attention to that. One great example of it, actually, was I had to look really hard before I found any ethics text that actually included racism as an issue, as an ethical issue. Now, I thought that was just kind of peculiar myself, right? But, it was not prominent in many, all right? More now, but 20 years ago, not so much. And even though it's present now, it doesn't mean everyone's putting that in their ethics text. Let's just put it that way. So here's a way to start getting at the question of why might Christians say they should care about justice? Well, I think we had to start with the question of what is our view of a word like gospel, right? Christians are always talking about, we want to spread the gospel. We believe the gospel. We experience the gospel. Well, what do we mean exactly when we're talking about it? Now, a lot of times what gospel means for people is a personal encounter with Jesus and the appropriation of justification, the appropriation of the atonement, that experience of that encounter with that. And it kind of stops there. It kind of stops there. But it's interesting to think, to ask ourselves the question, what if we went at it this way instead? All right. What do we think Jesus meant? All right, and here I'm kind of covering territory that was just covered, but so I'm going to fly over it. But in Luke 4, Jesus is baptized, the Spirit comes upon him, he goes out in the desert, he resists the temptation, he comes back in the power of the Spirit, he goes in the synagogue, he picks up Isaiah. You kind of think with all this Spirit language at Luke, he's probably going to read a text that has something to do with the Spirit. Surprise, surprise, he does. Isaiah 61. He reads that, right? So the Spirit of the Lord is upon him. And what does he say that means, that the Spirit of the Lord is upon him? This language about releasing captives, this language about getting over oppression. I remember when I was in my exegesis class and we talked about that text. And we said, what does that text mean? Does that text have any actual non-spiritual implications? Is that just about, because Jesus did recast things, and this is part of the reason why his own received him not. But did he only mean this in a spiritual sense? Or was there actual some physical dimension of this that mattered? And it was interesting how some people were very convinced that the answer to that was no. All right? But if you read Isaiah 61, it's kind of hard to escape that it has something to do with restoration, of the whole world, actually. So Jesus quotes Isaiah 61. If we think about what happens after the baptism in Mark 9, He announces the advent of the kingdom. A kingdom is coming. After his ministry, his death, and his resurrection, before he ascends, the beginning of Acts 1, the disciples want to know, are you restoring the kingdom at this time to Israel? Well, what are they expecting? What are they asking him for when they're saying, are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel at this time? Are they just saying, hey, can we have more miracles? Is that what they're asking for? I don't think that that's what they were asking for, because they were Jews who knew what it meant for the kingdom to come in fullness. I mean, what they really wanted, I think, was, do we get to march on Rome and take over the world? I think is what they really wanted, right? And Jesus says, sorry, can't tell you, and now I'm going to see you later. But before I say see you later, I'm going to commission you to go out and be witnesses to this kingdom. So what does it mean to be witnesses to that kingdom that's going to come? And what does a witness mean in its fullest sense? And if by talking about gospel, we're talking about a gospel of the kingdom, what does that kingdom mean? And how you think about the presence of that kingdom has massive implications for what you think your priorities are going to be. Massive implications. And those massive implications have a lot to do with your, here's going to bring in another doctrine here, your eschatology. How does that kingdom ultimately arrive? What's the relationship of Christian action to some kind of presence of that kingdom? Or, as some people say, now, I'm not a triumphalist, okay, so this is not my view. Not my view, okay? But, if I was a triumphalist, I would say, it's my responsibility to make the kingdom happen. And if I'm at the opposite extreme, I say, look, Jesus is going to bring it all. We just need to say he's going to bring it all. Well, if you're between being a triumphalist, and I don't think you should be a triumphalist, let me just say that. Okay, because we don't see clearly enough to be triumphalists. Okay, we make too many mistakes. But between being a triumphalist or being a person who says the kingdom's just totally future and all we do is just say it's going to come, if there's some way that being these witnesses to the kingdom that Jesus is talking about, and if this is part of our understanding of the gospel, being witnesses of that kingdom, what does that mean in terms of our priorities? What does that mean in terms of our practices? So if you're going to talk about bioethics, for example, I mean, why, if I have a kingdom commitment of some sort, let's say, if I think being a kingdom witness is important, how much effort am I putting in to understanding how things are advancing and developing in the world of medicine, in the world of biotechnology? How much focus am I giving that? How much of a priority is that? Now, if I only think that Jesus is bringing the kingdom at the end, and all I need to do is just tell people that the kingdom is coming, I might observe that those things are happening. But how much engagement am I going to have with that? In other words, am I going to care that the New York Times Magazine gives an article to Ray Kurzweil talking about singularity? And I think, well, that's interesting. That's interesting, kind of sci-fi, etc., but who cares? Because Jesus is coming in the end, and, it might be ugly if something like that happens, but it was interesting to observe. Or do I say, there are reasons to be concerned about that. There are reasons why we should think about what it means to participate in a world where someone thinks this is a good idea. And it might at the least be a good idea to provide a counter narrative, not just to our people, but to the larger public, because we should care about that. And that my kingdom priorities lead me to saying I should provide that counter narrative. And of course, if I'm a triumphalist, then I don't just provide a counter narrative. I might, say, no, we need to actually not just provide, another technology, but a technology that actually we actually may even impose on others. I mean, I'm going extreme with triumphalism in saying that, but that's a way, that's a position someone could take. the point here is this. What you think about the presence of the kingdom and the Christian relationship to that presence of the kingdom, and what Christians do to witness to that kingdom, and what witness means in terms of what you say and what you do and how you and what you give priority to in terms of your obligations, it makes a difference. It makes a huge difference. So, what difference does that make for you? Let me get at it one other way in light of something that Dr. Van Gemeren said last night. He noted that there's a change now, that people want to have a more holistic view of their faith. Well, here's a way to understand why he said that. Because I don't want to presume everybody understands that narrative. In the 19th century, pre-Civil War, you did have a dominance of what you call a post-millennial eschatology. A post-millennial eschatology means that Jesus doesn't come back until after what's called the millennium occurs. This 1,000-year reign of peace that's spoken of in Revelation 20. The way that some people operated as a result of having that eschatology was they were very fervent in their social action. So you had things like temperance unions. You had people pursuing women's suffrage. For some people that were abolitionists, that played a role for them. And there was the optimism that through a kind of worldwide proclamation and also these kinds of social practices, we might see a grand conversion take place. And what was very, very optimistic. Notice I said pre-Civil War. The Civil War and industrialization did a great job of devastating that optimism. And instead of having that sort of positive interpretation of where history was going, a more negative interpretation of history gained more prominence. Now what also happened, though, was coming out of mainline Christianity, particularly in the early 20th century, was what was called the social gospel. Because with the rise of industrialization, you had lots of problems in cities. And how do you talk about these new problems? How do Christians address that? So you get someone like Walter Rauschenbusch articulating the gospel in a very imminent way, where you talk about salvation in terms of addressing those ills. And people who, that held on to what we would call the fundamentals, or people we would call the precursors of modern day evangelicalism, they were very wary of the social gospel because it swung the pendulum so far to making the gospel only about making things better on earth now, let's say, and not thinking about people's personal relationship with Jesus or about Jesus bringing a kingdom at the end. Well, so what I call an allergy to social engagement was fairly common. So even though in the 1970s you get the Lausanne movement and you get this statement that says when we talk about Christian mission it includes social engagement, yes, it was a statement, a lot of people signed it, but lots of people didn't. And lots of people still thought, I just don't know that you should talk about that kind of thing as part of what mission is or as part of an application of the gospel. And that was still the case when I showed up here at seminary in 1990. I remember very vividly a conversation where we were talking with a missions professor, and you could see the nervousness when we talked about whether you should talk about social engagement as part of Christian mission. Because there was this fear that if you took things of social concern in the present too seriously, that it would swallow up attention to things like people's eternal destiny. All right? So, it's not surprising when that happens, because what human beings do more easily is swing to one extreme or another. What's harder to do is to say, yes, the social gospel was an overreaction, but that overreaction doesn't then give us reason to say that we shouldn't be also engaged in those things while holding on to what we also hold on to in terms of talking about people having personal encounters with Jesus and talking about eternal life and talking about Jesus coming in the end, etc. You don't need to have a dichotomy. But dichotomies are easy. Dichotomies are easy, so it's not really a surprise that these things happen, right? So now we're at a point where people want to have a holistic faith, but my sense is that they want to have a holistic faith, but they can't really give you a theological rationale as to why. It's more like a Christian intuition as to why. So we're in this moment, but there's still the question of how do you understand what you believe so that what you believe issues forth in a kind of engagement where you would take the concerns of bioethics or politics or cultural engagement or Hollywood or whatever seriously. So we still need to do that work. But what if you say you want to do that work and you're trying to sort out the kingdom question in a different way? I bring this up because there's a trajectory among some where they're talking about what they call a two kingdoms approach. Now, those of you, let me just do a show of hands. Is anyone here a Lutheran? Okay. So I won't ask you to tell us what two kingdoms is, but a two kingdoms approach says we have the kingdom of the church, and that's what we do is worshiping people, and there's the kingdom of the world where you do the rest, let's say. And you're really the citizen of these two spaces, and you certainly participate over here in the kingdom of the world, but you're reticent to bring the particularity of Christian belief into what you're doing over here. And this is an important thing. If you have a two kingdoms approach, and you're talking about bioethics, the way you're going to go about bioethics is not by asking, how does what I believe about kingdom or gospel or church or salvation influence what I do over here? I'm going to say, how do I do well what I do over here? How do I learn well what I do over here? But I'm not going to say, what's a Christian approach to these things, because that's not what you do in this kingdom. So that's not my approach, but it's important to know that if you answer the question that way, that will have very particular implications of how you go about thinking about a question like justice, and justice related to bioethics or any other public concern. So, interesting way to think about it. Another theological thing to think about that was touched on, and we kind of went back and forth on it in the Q&A, I noticed. How do Christians think about really the question, what is a Christian in terms of what is their identity? What does that word mean? Does being Christian mean, for example, member of the church? Does it mean member of the church? Or only member of the church? Does it mean that when a Christian understands themselves in the world, do they think about themselves as an alien or an exile? Or do they think about themselves as having a dual citizenship or a single citizenship? What does it mean to say something like, we are people who belong to God? Okay, so if Christians belong to God, what does that belonging mean in terms of, for example, how you interact with your government? Now, I'm not a Mennonite. Okay, I'm a Kuyperian, so obviously I'm not a Mennonite. But I have friends that, if not Mennonite, are at least Anabaptistically inclined, shall we say. All right? So they would say that to be Christian is to be part of a people, that people is the church, that people has an allegiance to Christ ultimately over everything else, and we see ourselves set off from the government. That doesn't mean that we don't do, a debate about whether we do things like vote, if you're a Mennonite, or whether even you would run for office. I mean, some would, many would not. But you see yourself as, to use the word, some people put it, an alternate polis. If you're an alternate polis, another community, what does that mean for how you think about the government's application of justice? What do you do if society is unjust? Well, what you don't do is try to make the government do what the church should do. You instead inhabit your community fiercely and express a way of life that models this justice for others. And you don't have any pretensions, by the way, about ultimate victory or being in control of things. So, I mean, it's a very, very interesting way to answer it. But what if you answer it a different way? What if you say something like this? A Christian is a person who belongs to God, who's rightly related to Jesus Christ, who's part of the people that God has always wanted to have, but this idea of this people goes back to what God's always wanted for human beings. And that one then says, well, so really to be a Christian is to be a person that is trying to become a fully realized human being. And in being a fully realized human being, surely you're part of your worshiping community, but you're also a participant in all the other domains of life. And as you participate in these other domains of life, you might do things like run for office, participate in the structures of society. You might go to law school and become a judge. You might become a lobbyist or a policy analyst. And you see, these are ways that you're inhabiting the world as someone who's on a trajectory of trying to live like this fully realized human being. And you say, well, what is a Christian? A Christian is someone who is becoming what humans always should have been in the first place. That's another way of thinking about it. And if you're thinking about it that way, then how you might participate in the various challenges facing us. So that very interesting example you gave about, now I'll make sure I got it right, women who were in prison, yes, saying that they had a right to IVF, yes? Okay, that's a very, very interesting situation. Well, I might be very engaged in the questions of policy related to that, as opposed to simply observing it. But my way of being involved in that, because if I think about being a Christian as being a fully realized human being, my way of thinking about what's going on with government is, well, we're really interested in things, as we use words like common good or human flourishing. So when I think about policies, rights, etc., I'm thinking about how am I getting toward human flourishing here? And I'll ask in a situation like this, I'll ask about IVF, is IVF always a good thing? I'll ask that question, rather than just presuming that it's a right. Or I might ask, okay, if IVF is happening in a situation of imprisonment, what are really the consequences of this if women have their right and they experience IVF and they carry a child to term? And while they're still in prison? I might ask that question and say, well, there are reasons why I would challenge this, irrespective of what concern I have about IVF. There are larger concerns I have about what could be the ends of this if this policy, becomes normative. And my reasons for opposing it would be based on a conception of what the common good is, what human flourishing is. Because I'm saying, I'm not thinking about that woman, I'm thinking about the child, and I'm thinking about all the studies that tell us, again and again and again, about the difficulties of children who grow up in distressed situations. I mean, there's just an article I just read the other day about the problems with males in broken homes and how it's particularly fatherlessness. It's not whether you have a stepfather or an uncle or some other male that steps in. It's just not having a father, and the way that's devastated, a large number of males. And how we continue to have that problem perpetuating things related to their educational possibilities, economic opportunities, etc. So if I'm thinking about those things, and I'm thinking about, again, to be a human is, to be Christian, to be a fully realized human being, and I'm participating in a society, and I'm thinking about trying to have some kind of common good, which has to do with what is best for humans, or this realized human beings idea, well, I have to think about what would be the possibilities for these children if they're born while their mother's in prison. Now, I'm presuming that some of the women, if they had IVF, would still be in prison and have the children in prison. I'm presuming that. Okay, all right. So I mean, that would be a difficult situation for those children. So that will play a role in how I thought about what we should do there. It wouldn't be just about IVF, it would be about the really larger public good question. All right. Okay, and what I'm seeing is that I have 10 minutes, and I'm hearing my brother's voice in the back of my mind now, who says, Vincent, you always have something to say, and I have 2 other things that I want to say in 10 minutes. Okay, this always happens to me. I really didn't think this was going to happen. I promise you, and it's happening again. Okay, all right, so I told you that I was going to say something about Kuyper besides the fact that he would try to take over the meeting. All right, so what might someone like Kuyper say about this question theologically? What I've hinted at but not said explicitly is this. What you would find in Kuyper is a view where I say, when I talk about putting the entirety of the story together, having coherence in my articulation of the Christian faith, I would do it in a way where creation and redemption are not at odds with each other. Where redemption is not escape from creation, or it's new creation but it has no relationship to old creation, but rather where there's more continuity than discontinuity. So I would read a passage like Romans 8 where it talks about the creation groaning for its redemption, and that would at least be a hint to me that what happens eschatologically when we talk about new heavens and new earth isn't God says, don't you love mushroom clouds? This will be the greatest mushroom cloud you've ever seen in your life. No. Instead, God says, I'm going to renew this. And it will be apocalyptic. It will be like a refiner's fire, but it's going to be renewed, not I'm going to just blast it all, like the end of, pick your favorite Star Wars movie when the Death Star blows up. It's a spectacular explosion. It's not going to be like that. It's going to be instead this thing that's renewed, and yes, there's this language of fire, etc., but what's there after that event is new heavens and new earth. There's continuity there. So the redemption then is not the destruction of the created order and replacing it with something else, but it's taking what started with a garden, and though it fell, it's at the end of the day leading it to its fruition where it's the city we have at the end of Revelation. So we start in the garden, end in that city. And what that means for Christian participation is We go to the original command given to humans, what I call the first Great Commission in Genesis 1. People call it the cultural mandate. I like to call it the first Great Commission because humans are being commissioned to have this stewardly dominion over the earth. Okay? That first, or I like to call it even forgotten, really, Great Commission, that obtains even though fallenness becomes normal. That commission remains for human beings. God doesn't say after the fall, hey, you remember all that stuff about filling the earth and doing it, having dominion, which basically means dominion, by the way, stewardly rule. The word stewardship isn't there, but a positive dominion is good stewardship. I mean, what do you call a good ruler? A good steward of his domain. So the word stewardship doesn't need to be there. Okay? You can say it's rule. What do you call a bad ruler? Someone who destroys what's, their territory. A good ruler leads their territory to its flourishing. Okay? That's good stewardship. So that's what dominion is. So God gives humans this mandate to lead this created order to its flourishing, to cultivate it. The fall happens. God doesn't then say, you remember what I said about all that stuff about dominion and it's yours? Forget it. Just run for your lives until I send a Savior. So then basically all it's about is one great attempt at survival until Jesus shows up. And all we tell people to do is just try to survive, really, until he comes back again. I would argue instead, what it is like when we read the curse, he doesn't say you won't have any fruit. He says you will have fruit, but you'll have weeds too. So it's going to be a lot harder, but your responsibility remains. Okay, that responsibility remains. God never says, you remember what I said about here's your mandate, remember what I said about the creation being good in Genesis 1:31, just put a big fat veto on all of that. No, those things remain, but the conditions now are much more difficult. But because that remains, that means our participation in the created order is normative. If that's normative, then what that means is that if you are in a social context where you can be a contributor to things that lead to flourishing in various areas, okay, and that leading to flourishing, I would argue, by definition, means you have a commitment to justice, because in order for people to flourish, we're really talking about people arriving at that, or experiencing in some way shalom, which to use the Neil Flanagan way of talking about it, that's everything being as it should be, okay? Everything being in right relationship. So some kind of experience of that's shalom, okay? That's sort of the end of flourishing, or the direction of flourishing. And if we talk about how people live their lives oriented towards that, as we do things around that, we are committed to justice. So if you want to say that shalom is sort of the end of justice, the ultimate manifestation of justice, I mean that's a way to think about it. Okay, I've got 4 minutes left. So I can say more about that because I really like talking about that. But I want to say something about Christology because I said I would like 40 minutes ago. So, the question is, how might your Christology inform your view of justice? You may be aware of the fact that Jesus is a very popular figure. And because Jesus is a very popular figure, there are many versions of Jesus in our culture. So the question is, what kind of Christology do you have? I mean, because you could have a Christology where Jesus is simply a hippie who says we ought to have a utopian society, but we just kind of hang out, and that's what we do. Or you could have a Jesus you say is committed to he's the embodiment of nonviolent resistance. Or you could say, well, no, Jesus is a warrior. Don't you remember what happened, in the temple. You know, what he did with the money changers. You can have those kinds of ways of talking about following a Jesus, okay, or a Jesus who overturned the laws of the Pharisees and showed us another way. It's another way people can get at it. Well, here's what I'd like to propose, and I think it has direct implications for bioethics. What if we talk about Jesus along the lines of it's only Irenaeus talks about this, but Irenaeus talks about a recapitulation theory of atonement, okay? And when Irenaeus is talking about recapitulation, he's basically saying this is a second Adam Christology. So Jesus is the second Adam who succeeds where the first Adam failed. He's one who basically takes up the entirety of human existence, and by going through that entirety of human existence, he makes possible our being in the image and likeness of God, which was altered or distorted, or to some dimensions, depending on your theology, lost with the fall. Now here's why I think there are incredible implications for bioethics here. Because in order for the incarnation to work out, and for this recapitulation theory to work out, that basically means that Jesus does this. Jesus takes up the entire sweep of human life from being an embryo all the way to being an adult. Okay? He takes on all of that entire trajectory. If Jesus takes that on, I mean, what is he saying about human life by taking that on? What is he saying by, if you will, sacralizing that from embryo to adult? What does that mean about human dignity? What does that mean about the child in the womb? What does that mean about the women carrying the child in the womb? Because it's a very, very important thing to know. A lot of times what happens in conversations about abortion is that we say a lot about the child, and the mother is incidental. I mean, if people knew, this is just I think this is true. If people knew that Christians cared as much about women in crisis pregnancy, the women themselves, as they did about the baby, I wonder how many women would be inclined to, one, never say, I think people who are against abortion are trying to control my body. And two, I wonder if they would say, I know who I can call when I've got a crisis pregnancy. There's a church I know I can call when there's a crisis pregnancy, because they care about women and their babies. And the reason they do that, why? Because what they believe about Jesus tells them, he took up all of our lives, and all of our life is important. All of our humanity is important. Whether it's, the child at the beginning of conception, or whether it's a person who is a teenager or an adult, but they're this human being at that stage of their life. Well, Jesus was at that stage of that life too. And he took up that life. So that's a way, just for instance, of how Christology, I think, can have interesting implications for bioethics. It's 11:46. I will stop.